y'all didn't know, I was a college athlete. I would have went D1, but instead I decided to go D3 and attend Upper Deckies University. But on a much more serious note, this episode is going to prime each and every single one of you for all your playoff matchups and even week 14 if you're in a win-in scenario. In this video, I'm going to go over all of the best matchups for the playoffs. Players, kickers, defenses, you name it, anything that can go in your starting lineup, the best matchups for the playoffs, because we need to lock in. We need to make sure we're setting the best lineups possible. If you're fighting to not be last place, this video is going to help you too, because guess what? You don't want to do your last place punishment. I know you don't. And if you're subscribed to me, you probably aren't going to do your last place punishment because your team is probably so good. But let's buckle up, let's lock in, and let's go over the best playoff matchups for this end of the season. Let's bring home a championship for each and every one of you. And more importantly, it's always White Monster time. Let's roll the intro. Let's start with the running back position first and foremost. Little bit on the obvious side. That's Saquon Barkley. So if you're playing against Saquon Barkley, avoid this team in the playoffs at all costs. We don't want the smoke. And if you got him on your team, then don't worry. Kick back, relax, and I'm about to tell you all about why he's going to dominate the fantasy playoffs this year. For teams that need a win this week, Saquon Barkley's going up against the Carolina Panthers in week 14. That is the #1 team in fantasy points allowed this season to the running back position. Follow that up with week 15, assuming you didn't get the bye week. Again, if you got the bye week, then I guess sit back, relax, just chill out for a little. The Pittsburgh Steelers are next in week 15. They give up the 5th most fantasy points allowed to the running backs. Week 16, follow that up. The Washington Commanders give up the 13th most points. And then the championship round gets a little tricky because they play the Dallas Cowboys, who give up the 8th fewest fantasy points. So unfortunately, it can't be all perfect for everyone. But Saquon Barkley's going to get you to the championship round if you have him. But I don't know if he's going to be enough to put you over the top. This same rule of logic applies for Derrick Henry. But if you're a week 14 team that needs a win, you're probably not getting that this week because he's on a bye. Follow that up with the Giants in week 15. The Giants give up the 7th most fantasy points allowed to the running back. Then in week 16, he's going to play the Pittsburgh Steelers that we just talked about. That's the 5th most points allowed to the running back position. But your championship round, if you're a Derrick Henry owner, is going to be tricky. They're playing a stout defensive unit like the Texans, who give up the 6th fewest fantasy points allowed this season. A lot of these players that have those great matchups are going to run across and face one team in this playoff series that's going to hurt them or maybe limit them in terms of being that fantasy superstar that we've seen the first 13 weeks of the season. And that same law of logic goes for Arizona running back James Conner. James Conner is going to play the Seahawks in week 14. That's the 10th most fantasy points allowed to the running back. Follow that up in week 15. He's going to play the New England Patriots, their 3rd most allowed fantasy points to the running backs. In week 16, Conner plays the Carolina Panthers. We just spoke about them in Saquon Barkley's bit. They give up the most points allowed. And championship round, he plays the LA Rams, who give up the 11th most fantasy points allowed to running backs. So that's almost basically a neutral matchup, but everywhere else it's a boom. Another guy that should absolutely boom once you get into the playoffs is Breece Hall. Breece Hall this week, if you need a win-in scenario, is playing the Dolphins. They give up the 12th most fantasy points allowed to the running backs, and we just saw them get gashed by Josh Jacobs. In week 15, Breece Hall is going to play the Jacksonville Jaguars, who are 6th most in terms of fantasy points allowed to the running backs. Follow that up in week 16. He's going to go play the LA Rams, 11th most fantasy points allowed. And finally, championship round, the Buffalo Bills, who give up the 4th most fantasy points allowed to running backs. The honorable mentions for running backs are Tony Pollard, Jahmyr Gibbs, Kyren Williams, and James Cook. So if you have any of those 4 guys, you should also feel really good about your scenario in terms of winning a championship and having good matchups in the playoffs. They're just not as extreme as playing the Carolina Panthers or playing the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now let's talk about wide receivers, and more importantly, wide receiver rooms that have great matchups in the playoffs. Even if you have these low-key guys, you still might be able to get a quick spot start out of them that end up being massive. Don't always be worried about playing the name brand guys like a DK Metcalf, for example. If you can find a way to not play him in a matchup that might not be so great, you know what you can grab is a wide receiver from the Vegas Raiders. In Week 14, they go up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who give up the most #1 fantasy points allowed to the wide receivers. Following that, in Week 15, they're going to go play the Atlanta Falcons, who give up the 7th most fantasy points allowed. Then, Week 16, Jacksonville Jaguars, we'll be talking about them a lot in the future here. They give up the 6th most fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. And while Week 17 championship round might not be as good as those last 2 weeks, but playing the New Orleans Saints is great because they give up the 12th most fantasy points allowed. So maybe you'll have a chance, whether it's now or before Week 15, to go add a Trey Tucker. I definitely would consider doing that because you never know. You might want to roll him out and give him a chance. You don't want to lose sleep over what could have been. And now this next team gets to play the Jacksonville Jaguars twice in the next 4 weeks. This is massive, massive fantasy value. The Titans wide receiver room should be upgraded for the rest of the fantasy playoffs and even this week as well. They play the Jacksonville Jaguars in Week 14, 6th most fantasy points allowed. Then they go play the Bengals, the 4th most fantasy points allowed. Follow that up with the Colts, who give up the 11th fewest. So that's not a good matchup. That's kind of like a neutral one. We could write that one off. And championship round, we're back again to play the Jaguars, which is a great matchup. And if you don't have any of those great players to have a great matchup, like a Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, Calvin Ridley, Trey Tucker, Jacoby Myers, George Pickens, don't worry, I got you covered with some honorable mentions. The Packers wide receiver room has great matchups over the next 4 weeks. The Chiefs wide receivers have a great matchup, but I really only would play DeAndre Hopkins. I don't trust Xavier Worthy at this point. And the Chargers wide receivers. So that means Ladd McConkey, and I would even throw Quentin Johnston in there too, even though some days he can't even catch a football. We just spoke about the Chargers, so let's tie this into what quarterbacks we need to be starting over the next 4 weeks, and that's Justin Herbert right at the top of my list. In Week 14, the Chargers go play the Chiefs. They give up the 8th most fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. Follow that up in Week 15, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are #1 in fantasy points allowed, so they give up the most points to opposing quarterbacks. In Week 16, they play the Denver Broncos. They give up the 18th most, so that's kind of like a neutral matchup, whatever. Hopefully he can survive that neutral matchup, because in Week 17 against the New England Patriots, mind you, a revenge game from last year that the Chargers should have won, the New England Patriots give up the 7th most fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position. So we have an elite quarterback with an elite matchup in the championship round. All the stars are aligning here to be a great matchup and great week if you get that far with Herbert. Another quarterback we should be rolling out with confidence is Baker Mayfield. If you have this guy, you're feeling great. Because in Week 14, he's playing the Raiders, who give up the 12th most fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. In Week 15, it's not a great matchup, but the LA Chargers give up the 19th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Kind of write that one off as a neutral matchup. Maybe you're a team that has a first round bye and you don't have to worry about that. But if your league mate with Baker Mayfield has the first round bye, be careful, because these next 2 games are going to be scary. In Week 16, Baker Mayfield's going to go up against the Dallas Cowboys. That's the 4th most fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. And in the championship round, the Carolina Panthers give up the 9th most fantasy points allowed. And boy, I really can't believe I'm about to do this, but for the 3rd video in a row on this channel, I'm going to be talking about Will Levis, quarterback of the Tennessee Titans. Just hear me out. Because I know he's widely available. I know you're not going to pick him up, but just listen to the argument I'm about to lay out for you. This week in Week 14, he plays the Jacksonville Jaguars. That's 2nd most fantasy points allowed to the quarterbacks. In Week 15, the Cincinnati Bengals give up the 3rd most fantasy points allowed to the quarterbacks. This is going to be more of a neutral matchup in Week 16. The Indianapolis Colts give up the 15th most fantasy points allowed, which is still a pretty good matchup even though it's a neutral matchup. And finally, going back in the championship round to play the Jaguars is too good to pass up, I'm telling you. Now let's talk about the tight end position, where I have 3 guys that really stand out, followed by some honorable mentions. But that first one is Okonkwo of the Tennessee Titans. Are you seeing a pattern here? Are you seeing it? We love starting players against the Jaguars. That's going to be their best games to play them. Those are the money games. So at least for weeks 14 and week 17, you gotta be rolling this guy out. I'm telling you. Okonkwo is not a name that you normally hear as somebody that needs to be started or needs to be rostered. But just for the sake of playing the Jaguars these next 2 weeks, and given that this season the tight ends have not been that impressive, there's been a lot of disappointment. Unless you're somebody who drafted Brock Bowers, pats on the back to you. We'll get to that in a second. But Chiggy's matchups are no joke. So if you need a tight end, if you don't feel good about the guy you're starting, you gotta be playing this guy. But let's now talk about Brock Bowers, who has some great matchups the rest of the season. No, you weren't going to consider benching him regardless of what I said, but hear me out. This is a smash play, and if you're going up against a team that has Brock Bowers, tread lightly because you don't want the smoking. In Week 14, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers give up the 4th most fantasy points allowed to the tight ends this season. Then follow that up with the Atlanta Falcons, who give up the 14th most fantasy points allowed. In Week 16, Brock Bowers is going to play the Jacksonville Jaguars. We love that. That's the 2nd most fantasy points allowed to the tight ends. But I hope you have some monster Week 17 matchups in your bag, because he's going up against the New Orleans Saints, and they give up the 9th fewest fantasy points allowed to the tight ends. So Brock Bowers can get you to the championship round, but can he put you over the top and win it? I'm not so sure. And Trey McBride, another elite tight end, has great matchups, so you don't want to play this guy in the playoffs. This week in Week 14, the Cardinals play the Seattle Seahawks. That's 13th most fantasy points allowed to the tight ends. Nothing too crazy. Follow that up with the Patriots, who give up the 7th most fantasy points allowed to tight ends. In Week 16, the Carolina Panthers give up the 3rd most fantasy points allowed. But like I said, it can't be all good. So in Week 17, the Rams, that's the 10th fewest fantasy points allowed to the tight end. And the honorable mentions here are as followed. Cade Otton, David Njoku, and TJ Hawkinson also have great matchups, and you should feel great if you have any of those 3 guys as well. I just can't make this video 20 minutes long talking about how great all of their matchups are, so I'll sprinkle them in as some honorable mentions. I'm all about giving options. That's what I'm about to do with the kickers for the playoffs. In Week 14, the Vikings will play the Atlanta Falcons, who give up the 8th most fantasy points allowed to kickers. Follow that up in Week 15, the Chicago Bears give up the 6th most fantasy points allowed to kickers. So if you need wins over these next 2 weeks, look no further than whoever's kicking for the Minnesota Vikings. But if you need great matchups for the last 2 weeks of the fantasy season, you already clinched that first round bye, you're not worried about this week and you ain't worried about next week, look no further than Chad Ryland of the Arizona Cardinals. And you can also start Chase McLaughlin as well in the last 2 weeks. They have some of the best matchups out of the kickers for the last 2 weeks of the season, at least in terms of fantasy season. And for the honorable mentions at kicker, if you just need somebody to get you to the championship round, Jake Moody has great matchups from now until Week 16. So definitely pick him up and start him if you're trying to avoid last place or need somebody to get you to the championship round. And finally, this has kind of been my area of expertise all year. Haven't been giving this information out on the channel, but now you finally get a little secret sauce on the best defenses to play from here on out. The Bengals defense have a great matchup from now until Week 16. Even though they haven't been a great producing defense this year, don't let that take away from the fact that you can still spot start them in the playoffs and get good results. In Week 17, they do play the Denver Broncos. That could be a toss-up whether the Broncos run all over them or have a lot of success on offense and they don't have a good week. Or the Bengals could keep it rolling, have a hot next 3 weeks, and Week 17 be feeling themselves and have another great week. But if you can't get either one of those defenses, I really like the Falcons and the Jaguars for the rest of the season. Even though the Jaguars do play the Titans, and I was advocating for you to grab the Titans players and start them in these playoff matchups, they still have a really good chance to show out on defense. All it takes really is one turnover. Maybe that one turnover becomes a pick six or a fumble six, and then you're rolling in the fantasy points. But if you've clinched the playoffs, you have a first round bye, and you're only worried about the last 2 weeks, you could definitely grab the Packers or the Colts defense for those last 2 weeks and get a instant upgrade to your fantasy lineup. So that's every position: QB, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, and defense. Wow, this was a long video. If you stuck around for this entire video, thank you so much. If you're new to the channel and you like fantasy football content, make sure you subscribe down below. I just gave you a Bible worth of playoff matchup information. And it costed you nothing to get that information. And all I ask in return is you just click one button down below. And if you like this video, or hell, even if you're in the fantasy playoffs, smash that like button so I know I have an army of people that are ready and locked and loaded for these playoffs. Did I miss a matchup that you love in these playoffs? Did I leave out a player that you have on your team that you're feeling really good about? Let me know in the comments down below. We could have a discussion about it. But thank you so much for watching. My name is Turtle. This is Outlier Fantasy, and I will see you in the next video.